Hello, thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jo Briggs, and I am the Jenny Waters Delano Curator of 18th and 19th century art at the Waters Art Museum. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to read the Waters Land Acknowledgement. The Waters Art Museum acknowledges the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations that originally inhabited the land on which this museum is located. We also acknowledge tribal nations, most notably the Lumbee, who migrated here, and indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects we steward in our collection. So welcome to this installment of the Waters series of object-focused programs, where we do a deep dive into a single artwork from multiple perspectives. Tonight, we're focusing on one of the stars of the Majolica Mania exhibition, a 5-foot-tall, life-size ceramic peacock made in 1876 by the British firm of Minton & Co. And I always start tours of the exhibit with the peacock. Not only is this object visually stunning, it neatly introduces many of the themes explored in the exhibit. It celebrates the beauty of the natural world, while also being a product of an industrial process that used coal-fired kilns and glazes with very high levels of lead. Both of these things polluted the environment, and the lead was poisonous to pottery workers, often women, who painted the glazes on the ceramics. The peacock was manufactured using cutting-edge technology in kilns particularly, which Minton developed. At the same time, it looked back to the ceramics of the Renaissance, particularly maiolica, which is a tin-glazed ceramic of the Renaissance. And I know that that's a little bit confusing that we have maiolica and majolica. And the peacock also looks back very specifically to Bernard Palissy's work, and he was a French Renaissance potter. So the peacock, which has been nicknamed Percy by the collectors who own him, which is something that we've taken to calling him at the Waters as well, Percy is going to be the jumping off point for our discussion this evening. And I should say the Majolica Mania exhibition is up until Sunday, which is only a few days away. However, I'm very happy to announce that the peacock is going to be on long-term loan to us. And so I want to thank Phil and Deborah English, who own Percy the Peacock, for the extension of that loan. It's also a promised gift to the Waters, and so it's incredibly exciting and wonderful news that Percy will be with us for a little bit longer. So thank you to the Englishes for that. So this is probably a first in Waters programming history, in that we have the unique talents of a zoo educator combined with the knowledge of a contemporary artist, who are going to be sharing their perspectives on peacocks from scientific and artistic points of view tonight. Our first guest is Sarah Peterson, who has worked at zoos in New Orleans and Florida, and is currently the guest engagement coordinator at the Virginia Museum in Norfolk. So hi to Sarah, lovely to see you this evening.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And secondly, I would love to welcome Jason Piccoli, who currently teaches ceramics at the Anne Arundel Community College and is a longtime artist in residence and instructor at Baltimore Playworks. So hello to Jason.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And Sarah and Jason are going to share their perspectives with us. Then we'll have a little discussion time. And then finally, I will be scanning the comments for your questions so that I can put them to our experts tonight. So without further ado, welcome Sarah again, and over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. Once again, my name is Sarah Peterson. I am the guest engagement coordinator at the Virginia Zoo down in Norfolk, Virginia. I have worked there for just over 3 years. And while I am not a peacock keeper, We do have some peacocks that do free roam around the zoo. We have 2 males and 2 females, I believe. And so you can see them there on the screen. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about sort of just peacocks as an animal, some of the science behind their amazing colors, just a little bit about how humans can connect with birds in general. So hopefully everyone is at least a little bit familiar with peacocks. You're probably a little more familiar than you think. They're actually in the same family as things like chickens and turkeys and pheasants and quails. It's called Phasanidae, I believe is how you pronounce it. It's basically the game bird family, and they are native to India and Sri Lanka, but of course they are found all over the world now. They are the national bird of India, but they are partially domesticated, and like I said, they are found in human care all over the world. When they are in the wild, they are found in sort of an open forest habitat, but they do very well, which partially probably led to their partial domestication on cultivated land. So land that has been developed for agriculture with human activity, they do just fine there. That's partially because of what they eat. They are omnivores, so they can eat a little bit of everything. They eat a lot of fruits and grains primarily, but they will eat a lot of insects. But they're also not above hunting small animals as well. They'll eat lizards and snakes and just pick at other plants. A previous zoo that I worked at had a peacock that had an appetite for dill, and we had an herb garden, and the dill would not survive because the peacocks would hop in and munch pretty much exclusively on that. So they will eat a little bit of everything. They weigh about 8 to 13 pounds, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot for a bird of their size, but birds are generally more lightweight than you would expect. They have hollow bones, and feathers, frankly, don't weigh that much. And so they are pretty heavy, but despite that, they are actually capable of flight. Again, though, because they can weigh up to 13 pounds, they don't prefer to fly. They can definitely get into the air, but they would prefer just to fly to like low branches of trees. The females that you can see there in that photo, those photos at the zoo, they like to sit on the roof of our farm buildings. So they don't like to go very far or very high, but they can actually fly. Their lifespan is about 15 to 20 years, so they are a pretty long-lived bird. And there are a few that have lived in human care even longer than 20 years. They are not considered an endangered species, partially because they are found so commonly in human care, but even in their wild native range, they are not a threatened species. And that is because of their cultural significance. They are protected by law, and just culturally, it is generally frowned upon to hunt them or disturb the areas where they live. So they are protected that way. And then, of course, because there are so many already in human care, there isn't a lot of exchange happening between the human care populations and the wild populations. So we aren't taking any from the wild, but we also aren't generally putting any back through conservation breeding programs or anything like that. Both populations are very stable. And what I want to point out on these photos before I go to the next sort of thing I want to talk about is I've mentioned the females already, but the star of the show, of course, is Percy, a male peacock, who are known for those fantastic tails. And what I've already said to you is actually not true. It's technically not their tail. It's a set of almost 200 feathers that actually come out from their back just above their tail. They're called tail coverts. Their tail actually is only made of about 20 feathers. And I have some feathers here. These are actually from our females. And these are either tail or wing feathers, but they are, mostly brown, sort of a brownish orange color. Not quite so flashy. This one comes from our female that is partially white. She has she's got what's called leucistic coloration. So she's not entirely albino because she does have some melanin or some dark pigment in her feathers. If she was albino, she would have none. But she does have some, so she's called leucistic. And so those feathers are very much like any other bird feather that you would find. But it is those fantastic tail coverts that the males have that really, of course, make the peacock so popular. And I've got a few of those here with me as well. But hopefully people have seen a peacock in person and are familiar with just how long those tail feathers are. I don't know if you can really get a scale of it. These peacock feathers that I have here are probably about 4 feet long, with plumage, fluffiness on most of that. So they're really, really fantastic. Only the males have those through a process of what we call sexual selection, which causes them to have sexual dimorphism. And so basically, they use them for impressing the females during the breeding season. And when the breeding season is over, so breeding season is generally late spring through early summer. And so they have the feathers February through August. At the end of August, they say, get these off of me. And they go through a molt, which means they shed those feathers. And then they have just the short tail feathers for the rest of the year. And so sexual dimorphism is when males and females of animals look drastically different. And so you can see this in a lot of species. You can see it in lots of birds. So cardinals and mallards, and I believe those are wood ducks there on the screen, and peacocks, and all kinds of birds have it. Sorry, those are mandarin ducks. And but lots of other animals have it. So deer with their antlers, lions with their manes. If any of you are familiar with orangutans, male orangutans have these fantastic fleshy cheek pads that the females do not have. Invertebrates have them. Lots of spiders have big size differences. Butterflies have different colorations in males and females, and even fish. Anglerfish females, the ones that have the little lantern on their head, the females are many, many, many times larger than the males. So it happens all throughout the animal kingdom. But basically, again, like all it is, sexual dimorphism when the males and females look different. And even today, scientists aren't quite sure how it works, how sexual selection works, why males and females look different, how these traits come to be. And famously, it made Charles Darwin very angry when he was coming up with his theory of natural selection, which is when animals with, the survival of the fittest, their genes are the ones that get passed down to their offspring, and those traits that most likely help them survive get passed on. Sexual selection does not fit into that. So a peacock with this 4 foot long tail, the males become very, very at risk of predation. Something can very easily grab that tail and make them a snack. And so it does not, you would think, lend themselves to survival. And so Charles Darwin was quoted as writing to someone and saying, the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Like, he was very angry about it. He failed to see an adaptive advantage for this tail. So he came up with sexual selection as a sort of secondary theory to natural selection, but was never really very happy with it. So different people over time came up with other theories. An artist, Abbott Henderson Thayer, actually proposed that it was a form of camouflage, this ridiculous tail, which a lot of people heavily criticized. He said that every color pattern in nature has to be for camouflage. It may be for actually blending in, or it may be something called disruptive camouflage, which is a real thing. That's what we see on zebras. Their stripes, when they are basically blending in with each other to confuse predators, that's considered disruptive coloration and disruptive camouflage, but that's probably not what's happening with the peacocks. And so, again, sexual selection seems to be the most likely theory. It seems to, in a lot of animals, the bright colors or the large mane or the large antlers, those take energy to create. Like I said, they're growing the tail every year. Deer grow their antlers every year. Generally, pigmentation uses extra energy in the body to create. And so to have that extra energy, you have to be good at finding food and moving around. And theoretically, because of that, you are healthier. And so it's an indicator. It's what we call honest signaling to a mate that I am worthy of sharing my genetics with your offspring. So that's sort of where science is sitting now with sexual selection. It's probably a thing. That's probably what's happening, but it's not a very strong theory. And there are definitely still opponents for it as well. So with the peacocks, they've done lots of studies specifically on peacocks that show that females are selecting for the tail. They'll go in and scientists will trim off the little eye spots on the tail so that they have fewer eye spots, or they will just put the peacocks in different situations and change up the variables with the tail. And the females will choose or not choose depending on the situation. So we know they're choosing something related to the tail, but we don't know what just yet. So it's very, very interesting. And it's working for the peacocks. We don't necessarily understand it, but it is working for the peacocks. But what we do understand is sort of the science behind the color in their beautiful tail. And I think that is probably what has inspired most artists who have done renderings of peacocks, is their fantastic, fantastic colors. So blue in nature is very, very strange. It does not appear very often. And this is a true blue, not a purpley blue, not a greenish blue, like a very true blue, like you see in the body and the tail of a male peacock. Blue, very, very, very rarely. I can't actually think of an actual time when it shows up as pigmentation, but it very rarely shows up as pigmentation, meaning a chemical in the actual, in this case, feather that is giving it that blue color. Instead, it's what we call structural pigmentation. So if you've ever seen a prism, the little triangles of glass, white light shines through it and it breaks up into a rainbow. That is sort of a structure creating a different pigment. It's literally light just reflecting back in a different way, or breaking up and then reflecting back into your eyes a different way. That's what's happening in the peacock's feathers. So there are air pockets between the keratin, which is what makes up our hair, our fingernails, and also bird feathers. It actually has air pockets between the keratin and the feathers to make a prism-like structure that cancels out the red and the yellow and green wavelengths, and it amplifies the blue. And that's why we get that vivid, vivid blue. And I wish I could show you this in person, but if you ever have access to a peacock feather or anything else that's sort of blue and very thin in nature, so those blue morpho butterflies also work really well for this. There's an experiment that you can do where if you actually hold the light in front of it, of course, the light will reflect back blue and you'll see it in its full blue beauty. But if you take that flashlight and you shine it from the back, the object, the feather or the butterfly, will actually appear brown because the light is not reflecting off of that structure. And there's no, like I said, there's no pigment in it. So it's actually a brown object with the special structure to make it pure blue. And it's a really cool effect. You can probably find it on YouTube as well. But if you ever get a chance to see it in person, it'll blow your mind. It also doesn't have to be a peacock feather. If you have any other blue parrot feathers or anything like that, it works with any blue feather, which is very cool. Iridescence is very similar. So there are lots of iridescent things in nature. There are lots of beautiful beetles that are iridescent, and even some iridescent blue berries. These berries that are here are kind of famous for having structural pigmentation. And iridescence is very similar. It's also a prism-like structure in the object with some pigmentation as well, so that when it's looked at from different angles, you get that sort of changing of the color. There's often a blue in there, but sometimes it's a bluish purple, bluish green. And so peacocks have that as well. But lots of things in nature have iridescence, and it's really amazing. But again, we know exactly how it works structurally, but we don't really know why. We don't know why it evolved. There have been some studies that show that it actually, in this case, is camouflage, which is very strange. But there was a study where they hid little worms underneath really beautiful iridescent beetle shells and pinned them to trees and tried to see how many birds would come and eat those worms versus shells that were a solid color. And the worms under the iridescent shells did get to live a little bit longer than the ones that were under the solid shells. Birds seemed to avoid them. We weren't sure if it was because the birds couldn't see it or if because they thought the bright colors and iridescence was an indication that it was poisonous. But birds did seem to avoid them. So they tried it with humans. Humans also couldn't find the iridescent beetle shells pinned to trees. quite as well as we could find the solid color ones. And we weren't trying to eat them. So that was a really interesting study. There may be something about iridescence that throws us off and actually makes it harder for us to see. But we're not sure. It's not conclusive yet. Some other hypotheses include that it could be iridescence could be for sexual selection. Again, it doesn't always make sense because in some species of, for instance, beetles, both the males and the females are iridescent. So that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but it still could be part of it. It could also be for thermoregulation, managing your body temperature, being able to turn and sort of change the color of your body. The way that it reflects back light could actually help manage your body temperature. So the science of it is really, really interesting, really, really weird. And I think it's what's captivated people for so long. And so just to sort of wrap up with me, I can't go into a presentation without talking about bird conservation. So I'm not sure if we're able to go to our next slide. Oh, there we go. Thank you. But I think peacock or not, people are captivated by birds. They're usually quite colorful, energetic, charismatic. People love to watch them. And so that's why, you know, around the world, people have bird feeders and bird baths and bird houses in our backyards. Generally, we don't want wildlife too close in proximity to our homes, but birds seem to be the exception to that. We invite them in. And so I have nothing against that. Absolutely. I encourage you to want wildlife near you. And birds are incredible. They are pest control. They usually eat bugs, or they spread seeds by eating seeds and spreading them in their waste, or you know, they keep down rodent populations. If we're looking at birds of prey, they're incredibly important to the ecosystem. But here at the zoo, we actually had to have and zoos across the country did this. We actually had to have our birds off exhibit for a while because there was a highly pathogenic avian influenza, or a bird flu, that was moving through wild bird populations. And it was affecting primarily waterfowl, so ducks and geese, but it was affecting chickens really, really strongly, and occasionally things like songbirds as well. It was spreading because it was migration season, and birds tend to congregate during migration season. And just like every other illness, human or animal, when we congregate, we spread disease more easily. So we did have to take most of our birds off exhibit for that and make sure that we kept them under a cover. And a lot of our habitats for them were wrapped in plastic for a while to keep them safe. And fortunately, all of our birds came through the other side and were completely healthy. And most of them are back on exhibit now. But when we are working with birds, and inviting them into our spaces with bird feeders or bird houses or bird baths, we just want to be conscious of global events like that. Like I said, bird flu was happening across the country, and I believe also in Europe. And so if we hear about things happening, make sure that we're taking those bird feeders down. Make sure we're taking those bird houses and bird baths down for that time, for that migration season, so that those birds can move through the area naturally. They don't stop and congregate for longer than they need to. And hopefully we reduce the spread of those diseases. Even when there's not a bird flu moving through the area, it's still really important to clean our bird feeders and bird baths and bird houses. The feeders and baths should be cleaned probably weekly, if not more often than that, depending on how busy they are. And the bird houses you want to clean seasonally when the birds are done using them, again, to help keep them safe from parasites and other diseases. When we are bird watching, we do want to make sure to just give them our distance. Binoculars are wonderful, especially birds of prey. The closer we get, the harder it is for them to hunt. So if you are watching things like owls, it's an amazing experience, but just make sure you are watching them from a distance. Don't feed wild birds with your hands. So when you're going, bird feeders are great, but if you're going to the duck pond, it's very, very tempting to feed them. Sometimes they provide food at a duck pond, and usually that food is formulated for them and is healthy. And if that's the case and food is being provided, go for it. But if it's not being provided, it's best not to feed them. Excess food in a water supply can create an increase in nutrients, which creates an increase in algae and makes it all yucky. It may make the birds aggressive, because if you feed them and the next person doesn't, they may get upset, rightfully so. And we also just don't want to feed them things that are not healthy for them. Birds cannot survive on bread. it's not even really that healthy for humans, so we shouldn't be feeding it to ducks. And the way that you can feed them is by, like I said, putting up those bird feeders with seed that is formulated for birds, and just planting native plants. We have a lot of native plants at the zoo, and every year I see beautiful goldfinches coming and snacking on the flowers, which is really, really wonderful. So just planting native plants can invite them into your yard and give them everything that they need to survive. And then finally, we've been talking about wild birds for the most part, but I know birds are also a popular pet. So just make sure that if you are looking for a pet bird, that you're researching it from start to finish. Know exactly what it needs to what you need to do to care for it. Make sure that the source that you're getting it from is reputable. They're not taking birds from the wild, things like that. That they're breeding them responsibly, whatever the case may be. Birds can be a wonderful pet. They can live a very long time. Like I said, peacocks can live over 20 years and some parrots can live to be 80 or 90. So make sure you're prepared for that. But they are wonderful. Like I've said, they've inspired people. Clearly, they've inspired the artists that made Percy, and birds are found in art everywhere. So connect with them, have those feelings, those experiences. But just make sure we do so in a way that does not harm us or the bird. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the rest of our discussion for tonight.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was very fascinating and some wonderful tips there on how we can help to preserve bird life. So next I'm going to introduce Jason, who will talk from a ceramicist perspective.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for inviting me in to be part of this conversation. And thank you, Sarah. That was really informative, and your enthusiasm is infectious, for sure. I'm a ceramic artist. I've been working in clay for about 18 years, teaching for about 6. And I'm just thrilled to be a part of this conversation. My introduction to Myelica was during my undergraduate, and it was from a group of ladies who were auditing the ceramics course. It was like a group of super clay nerds that kind of took me under their wing. And seasoned ceramicists in their own right, they got what you might consider maiolica fever. And as auditors, they could explore whatever they wanted and chose to put their skills to the test, revisiting some different Myelica glazes and trying them on various red earthenware clay bodies. Trying their hands then at elegant brushwork on surfaces using a combination of stains and washes. They were gracious enough to take me along for most of the ride, and they let me use the materials that they had and included me in firings. And what I found was that the surface of the raw glaze took to a brush very beautifully, and the strong colors it would produce were mesmerizing. The final result, a slight sheen, but entirely uniform. But many problems were encountered. We discovered just about everything we fired had tiny little pinholes in the glaze. Some pieces dunted, which is when the glaze kind of squeezes the work very tightly and ends up breaking. Others, the glaze shivered off or crazed. Crazing is a term used to define like tiny little fissures or cracks throughout the glaze. The problem was somewhere, we thought, in the glaze choice and clay body combination. So to get the best clay glaze fit with no pinholing and no dunting was a challenge that they sought to take on by substituting different things and adjusting the original glaze formula with assistance from the instructor. That and trying different low fire earthenware clay bodies. I decided then I'd rather maybe just continue to paint on white clay because it was available and maybe bypass the whole thing. But I will say it was really fun revisiting an historical process and trying to get in touch with that and then get results from it. I could definitely see the appeal in the pieces that were successful because they really were gorgeous. With enough time and effort in the right places, I feel like an understanding dawns, and when the many facets of the process harmonize, the work just sings. I mean, the piece shown here features amber and green tones over the Myelica glaze, very quintessential colors for work in the Myelica heyday across Europe. Manufactories. The colors are achieved using iron oxide and copper carbonate, respectively. But these transparent colors with watercolor-like appearance can be seen throughout much of the work because they accentuate delicate relief by breaking light around the ridges and pooling dark in the recesses. And it can be applied fairly loosely with pretty nice effect. Moving on to the next slide. In my own work, I do find inspiration in the elegant classical forms and line work the history of Majolica has produced. Instead of carving or using a press mold, I throw the work on the wheel, trim, and then assemble the parts, and then use a process called water etching, where I paint a resist on where I want relief lines, and then I wipe around the area with a sponge, and the lines slowly take on relief by removing kind of the surrounding material. Rather than work with stains or washes, I tend to use underglazes to paint on imagery, and then that's fired onto the work. So pyrometric cones and colorants. The middle and right images here show what are known as pyrometric cones. The middle image shows what the cones look like before being fired. The right image shows cones after the firing, all melty. These cones are placed in a kiln and measure work heat, so temperature and time together. Josiah Wedgwood was using pyrometric beads, I discovered, to measure work heat as early as 1792. Now they're cones. Myolica is considered low fire, uses red earthenware, and fired to cone 04 or 03, which is about 1915 to 1960 degrees Fahrenheit, the number after the cone designating a temperature range. At this temperature, the cones 03 and 04 in the kiln, indicating visually that the kiln is within the temperature range, and the work heat has been accomplished when they bend. There's also mid-fire and high-fire ranges common to stoneware and porcelain clay bodies, and those fire much hotter to between 2165 and 2381 degrees Fahrenheit. The image on the left shows an oxide colorant storage cabinet, common to any glaze lab that's stocked pretty well, where tubs and jars and boxes and bottles and all sorts of containers hold the magic ingredients that give ceramics all its color splendor. Fortunately, lead is no longer included in there. It does make me think, though, about some of these other colorants that we use. Like, we're going to find out much later how awful they are. So disposing of this stuff properly in the glaze making process is super important. So thinking a little bit about terracotta, earthenware, or red earthenware, fires to a lower temperature than other clays. It is inexpensive to fire and uses less energy. Many Myolica glazes today use tin oxide, zircopacks, and friths. And a frit is basically a ground up glass used in place of lead together with the other ingredients. The thickness of Myolica on the clay is something which can present challenges. If it's too thin, you end up seeing the red clay underneath. Too thick and it will pinhole and cause small cracks throughout. The surface that you see is the surface that you get. So it's important to wipe off all the drip lines and bumps before painting because they will remain and be like little speed bumps to your painting process. But once the raw glaze surface is smoothed over uniformly, it presents an amazing surface on which to paint for those so inclined, using mason stains and oxides and washes. In addition to the lower temperature, it allows the colors to maintain their rich intensity. Unlike higher firing temperatures, which can sometimes burn off color saturation, because the Myolica glazes are so viscous and stable, the firing process does not move the brush stroke or draw or pull color and run it. So the reliable stability also allows the work to be glazed almost to the very bottom of the piece, without fear of having to grind drips off of the base later. Something high fire community definitely knows about. As many sources contend, navigating the challenges of Myolica today is not for the faint of heart. Even during a time when many more materials and firing options are available than they once were, many challenges are presented and must be overcome in order to achieve a refined finish. And as ceramicists always say to one another, it's like test, test, test before you commit too much time to any process you're learning about. So thinking about Percy, oops, I'm sorry, I meant to stay on Percy's slide, my mistake. So thinking about making him, I learned he's fired in one piece from parts made separately and then attached, which is a great way to do a large scale sculpture where you take a section, build it in its roughest dimensions, and then hollow it out and then stack on another piece and then hollow that out and sort of build that way. And I think the low fire option is a really great option for this method at this scale, around 5 feet tall, because the intense memory of movement clay can have, especially in a high fire situation. Like during one high fire kiln I was in, I had once had the neck of someone's really beautiful horse sculpture bend into my lidded jar and fuse to it. Prior to the firing, they were about 2 inches apart. So it's that serious heat work that's like, I remember where you moved me, so I'm going to bend that way. So firing the Peacock in a low fire environment is ideal because little to no movement is going to take place once it is assembled and set up in the kiln, which means a high reliability in the form remaining true post-firing. The artist lines of color are also generally where they put them, or where they're supposed to be. And the lower heat is adding a lot of confidence to color accuracy as well for the artist. So looking at this piece, I think the largest challenge would definitely be in rendering the details correctly after it was all fleshed out in its most general sense, especially the main plumage at rest at the back of the peacock. Uncountable lines really define the contour of each little feather group there, almost like its own segment, each expertly layered for a realistic softness and flow. Having him perched on this rock, I think, was a really brilliant stroke, so that the plumage can be somewhat spread out and better seen, while still allowing the sculpture to have a reliable center of gravity and like some structural integrity. The constraints of clay definitely can come into play in certain areas. Like thinking about this peacock with its plumage spread would be very challenging and extremely fragile and practically impossible to ship around. But yeah, I think that I think with this piece, if I were to do it, I would definitely work on it in small batches, few hours here, few hours there, just for my own sanity. But I think that I might predict around 150 to 200 hours at least for this work to be completed. So moving over to the next slide, and I think about doing this and then my own process. The nice thing about painting with underglaze, which is basically a high pigment colored slip on white clay, is that I don't have to worry as much about the problems which can crop up in a Majolica glaze firing. I can paint directly on the clay body and the lines stay where I put them. However, because of the mid-range temperatures I use, I have to layer the painting sometimes 3 or 4 coats thick to make sure no burnouts happen. So yeah, it's like I paint the image once and that takes forever, but I actually end up painting it around 4 times. So very time consuming, unlike Myelica where, you know, it can be thin washes and really tentative lines and really show off the color intensity with one coat. But the coat must be done well because it shows all the hesitations made in the brush stroke. And it can, you know, sort of remind you of any little hesitation. The other issue I contend with is sometimes light colors becoming lighter and others becoming darker. So the kiln plays a role in the painting that is very challenging to fully predict. It is the element of the unknown, though, that makes painting on clay with underglaze all the more fascinating to me. It's like the kiln is going to have its contribution, and it may be an awful curse or a wonderful gift. I suppose it depends on your kiln karma, but the kiln is definitely a contributing factor. So yeah, so that's my presentation about that.
Wow, thank you so much, Jason, and thank you, Sarah. I mean, wow, these are such insightful talks. It's amazing to see the peacock that I've been thinking about and working with for so many years through your eyes and just learning new things about it. It's really wonderful. I'm going to ask Sarah a question first that has been on my mind. So in a natural situation, would you see a peacock maybe perching on a rock like this? Is that something they do, or is that a little bit of a fiction?
No, they absolutely would. So like I mentioned, they can fly. They're not particularly fond of it. But they do seem to like to be up high. Like our females like to be on the roof. We also find them at the Virginia Zoo in our Prairie Dog Habitat a lot, which is basically a U shape or like a crescent shape of rockwork. And so they will frequently be perched on the edges of this habitat. And people take lots and lots of photos of them there. So yes, they like to they're a bird. They like to perch. And so, but they're not going to, grab onto a little branch like a songbird. So yeah, they definitely would sit like this, tail fully draped. I think, like Jason said, it is convenient for the artist to pose them this way, but also not an unnatural pose for a peacock.
Wow, that's great. So this is actually a pretty accurate in terms of peacock behavior. This is actually a pretty accurate rendering. I have my suspicions, and we know that artists at Minton were actually working from live specimens sometimes. I've worried sometimes that it might have been a taxidermied peacock that Paul Comolera, the sculptor, was working from, because that seems to have been a very popular piece of home decor for the Victorians to have a taxidermied peacock. But it's great to hear that there is some kind of truth to this posing of the bird. So I was going to ask a question to Jason next, and I think you answered this to some extent in your talk, but when you look at the peacock, what most surprises you about it as a piece of ceramic art?
Well, like as a maker myself, when I first saw this piece, I was intrigued by its size and the level of detail something this large contained. So as I looked around it and imagined tracing the artist's process and how I might empathize with it, I was thinking about the order of operations and so forth, but before I realized it was one of a kind, my jaw sort of hit the floor when I imagined the look on the master mold maker's face when asked to create a mold of this for replication. And I'm just thinking, that's a big ask. But yeah, I think, I don't know, I just think seeing it in person is really a very nice thing to have done. And it's just like you walk in, it's just this extreme color intensity, and then the scale of it, and you look even closer and see all this wonderful details. Just it's definitely see the reason why it's the object focus for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested to hear you, Sarah, talking about iridescence and sort of thinking about how those glazes on the Majolica glazes kind of have that sense of a kind of iridescence to them and a vibrant color. So there's this kind of perfect marriage going on in this piece between what the ceramic is capable of and that way that in nature you get that kind of prismatic, lustrous effect. There's something that's kind of been really intriguing to me during this process of researching the exhibition, which is that, I know we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but the Victorians really didn't have a separation between science and art in quite the same way that we do today. And I know that we sort of discussed that a little bit previously. I wondered if you could talk about the combination of those two things in your professional lives, the combination of science and art.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go first. because I am an educator at the zoo. So I work with guests of all ages, but a lot of children and a lot of young adults. And in school programming now, they have been pushing STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math for years and years and years. And more recently, not so recently, but within the last few years, science, or not science, but teachers and school boards and whoever came up with STEM realized that it's maybe more effective if it's STEAM, and we put an A in there for art. And I think informal educators like myself, not to toot our own horns, but I think we've always sort of realized that because art is very accessible and everyone can do science, but I don't think everyone realizes it. Science is just a process, it's just being curious and doing experiments and trying things and writing it down occasionally. But I don't think everybody realizes that. But everybody does art. Everybody goes out and creates. It's what we do from preschool on, and some people carry it through their entire life, obviously, and make a career out of it, which is wonderful. And so it's art, I think, feels more accessible than science, but they're very closely related. Trying new things and experimenting is part of science and it's part of art. And so I think the Victorians were on to more than maybe we give them credit for by not having such a clear delineation between the two.
Jason, do you want to add something to that?
Well, I'm thinking about like art and science, and I think, science as a process, it's like you have an hypothesis and then you observe and then you make notes and then you try and replicate. And artists, I think bringing nature into art, you become closer to it both emotionally and literally because you're spending more time than you may otherwise slowly observing it, studying surface, color, texture, form, and movement, and trying to render those visuals and that experience into an artistic expression using a medium, like clay, through form and image, and as accurately true to detail or as stylized as you wish. The science end of it is more very, very fact-based in observation. And then in the art realm, of course, you can, tug at different strings and start stylizing things a little bit more, but still kind of stay true to the subject. I think a bond definitely forms with nature as a subject, and its inherent preciousness kind of becomes obvious to you and automatic, like breathing. I think the connection there can feel pretty personal and profound and almost mystical, unless you can't quite get it right in your medium of choice, and then you hate it and you never want to see it again. Which, it's tricky to get things just right in clay, and that seems to always haunt the artist.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by the fact when you were talking that there are so many mysteries that still surround the peacock and its plumage. I tend to think, obviously, I'm an art historian. I was not good at science at school, but I tend to have this idea that science knows everything, and it can, of course, tell us why the peacock was doing that, but it's really not the case. I think some of that sort of mysteriousness is something that you were just speaking to, Jason, about what lets you have that connection, is that sense of mystery, maybe a little bit. But yeah, I know that we sort of all have been thinking about this a little bit, but I was very struck when working on Majolica that, I spoke about how the peacock, it sort of honors nature, it shows close observation of nature, but at the same time, the products, the way this was made involved coal, involved a lot of lead, it was polluting, and that was something the Victorians were very aware of. Ruskin, William Morris, they were all very concerned about how industry was affecting the environment. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you think about the environment in and through your work. Who would like to volunteer to go first? Should we have Sarah again?
Yeah, I can go first again. Obviously, all of my career is focused on connecting people to nature with the sneaky main goal of hoping that they will take action to protect it. And so, yeah, it is a little funny and ironic that this like very harmful process created this tribute to this very beautiful natural object. But I think that is something that, you know, not just this artist is at fault for. We very much destroy nature trying to appreciate it all the time. You know, when we fly to other countries to see wildlife, flights are horribly polluting, and really, I say that as someone who flies to Disney World like annually, and we're all guilty of it. But it is funny that we pave roads into parks to go see animals when, we should probably just leave it alone. But will we have that same connection to it if we can't go and appreciate it?
Sure.
It's I think just a conflict of human nature. And that's one reason why, I mean, I love zoos. Obviously, I work at a zoo. I think they're very valuable to the communities that they're in because they let people of most income levels, and you don't have to travel too many miles from anywhere in this country to go see animals from all over the world. So relatively minimal impact on the environment. And as long as it is a reputable, accredited zoo, the animals are receiving excellent care, and you can have that connection, hopefully without making too much of an environmental impact. But it's something that humans do, and it's something that we've always done. And I think finding a balance is something we're still trying to do.
For sure. Yeah. It's one of those really tough conundrums. And the Victorians, I mean, we're kind of in the same place. We haven't found the answer yet. Yeah. Jason, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah. The definite sad irony that the methods used to make the work which elevate nature are in fact harming it, and in the case of Myelica during its heyday, extensively so. Putting company profits ahead of even the health and well-being of children they employed, let alone the environment. It's truly despicable indeed, and it casts the work in a light that really is anything but comforting, no matter how beautiful the work may be. And you take that with you when you sort of look at these beautiful things. It's like this contrast. And I think that the exhibition really shows that very well, particularly with the memorial portion of that exhibit in response to like all the people who worked on it and everything. And I think in my own process, I tend to avoid high fire kilns, and like I fire an electric kiln, which uses less energy, and I make work that's very, very time consuming and usually pretty intricate. It takes me a few months to fill a kiln and fire it, and I try to only fire kilns when they are full because they certainly do use energy. And I also think a lot about where materials end up. I recycle clay and reuse it, and when mixing glazes, I'm very conscious of making sure that those materials are used as much as possible, and that the little that isn't used is disposed of properly. And they can always be mixed up to create a new glaze, or just as a liner in sculptural vessels and other things. Using everything with very little waste is extremely important to me, and I is a responsibility that lies with any artist. I think working in a medium which can cause potential harm to people and animals and the environment, if not handled with the right care, it's easy to just toss something in the trash, but like think about where that's going. It's like that's contaminating groundwater and harming wildlife. It's a very real thing, something that just takes it's like it starts with the individual person thinking about it and where that stuff goes beyond the trash can.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the most amazing images in the exhibition, although we only reproduced it at quite small scale, is this waste dump in Stoke-on-Trent, where you see where they have dug this huge pit out and they're throwing all of these damaged ceramics in there, and the scale of it is just unbelievable. To see this town on the edge of a cliff of broken ceramics. So we're getting close to the end of our time. I wonder if I might ask each of you individually a quick question before we wrap it up. So these are kind of specific little quick questions for you. And I wondered, Jason, I know that a lot of ceramics are lost in the kiln. Can you give us a percentage of your success rates when you fire up your kiln? Because I believe it's quite a high loss rate that we're talking about, and this really surprised me.
Yeah, I think if success defined as do I like it or not is a little different than did this actually survive the process? And I feel
Sure.
like the survival rate I have now after 18 years is pretty high. But I think 80% is you're doing pretty good with the survival rate of things. So many things happen in that work heat that, you know, it's just, you know, it comes back to how you handled everything and going back through your memory of it. And it's like, well, reflecting on that, you can correct for things, but yeah, the kiln's always going to have its say, no matter how carefully you try to do something. And then in terms of success rate, liking it, I think I'm about 50%.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just really surprised me thinking about, you know, these huge factories making ceramics, that there was so much that they just couldn't use. There was this sort of like built-in sense of something was going to have to go in the trash at the end of it, which is
and it's really fascinating. The place I work, a lot of students end up making work that they don't want, or you know, that we end up bisque firing it to the first stage to turn it from clay into stone. And we take a vast majority of those and use old glazes and glaze them up and sell them in a second sale. So
that's interesting. I think we need to do a research project on Victorian seconds. I'm sure there's some fascinating information about Victorian seconds.
I would love to go to that sale.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't eat off of any of it.
Well, so my very last quick question is for Sarah, and I think I understood you correctly that male peacocks only have these beautiful long tails for a certain part of the year. It's seasonal. So I wonder if we can you tell the month at which this sculpture of Percy was done? And also I wondered a little extra to that, is there any way you can tell how old this peacock is in this sculpture?
Oh, that's a good question. So I believe, I'm going to embarrass myself if I'm wrong, but I believe all of India is in the Northern Hemisphere, along with North America. And so our peacocks here in North America have their tail feathers. They start growing them in about February, and they lose them by the end of August. And so the two that I have here with me were just picked up off the ground. We did not have to take them off of the peacock. They do that every year. And like I said, there's up to 200 of these red feathers. So we have them everywhere. We just tell people to take them home if they find them. And so, so they, this would have probably been in the summer, because that looks like a very full tail. It's grown them all in, but hasn't started to lose them yet. So this is probably summer. Peak breeding season, peak trying to impress the ladies season. Eggs have not probably been laid yet, but are probably close. So peacocks usually want to have their babies hatch by the end of the summer, so that they can bulk up and get a little big before the winter. Obviously, they're tropical birds, so the babies don't have to be full grown and too bulked up by the winter, but they do want them to have the hatch during the like sort of peak food availability time. So this is probably like a June or July peacock, I would say. As far as the age, I don't think you can tell. Birds are very hard to know a lot about once they are past their first year. And this is my experience with songbirds. You can tell when they're yearlings based on some of the coloration in their flight feathers. And then once they're over a year old, you can't really tell anymore. So he's an adult, but I couldn't tell you how old he is.
So how long does it take them to get to adult roughly? Like they're adult basically within the year?
Birds grow very quickly, and I'm not sure how it is with peacocks, but it would not surprise me if it took more than a year or two for them to be considered fully grown. They may not be at full maturity. They may not quite, again, because we don't know exactly what the females are selecting for when the males are performing. We don't know if there's, particular dance moves that they're looking at too, that maybe the younger males don't have quite perfected yet. there could be behavioral things they still need to learn. So they may not be reproducing at 2 years old, but they probably look just like their dads at 2 years old.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I just wanted to echo thanks, Zachary, in the comments, right? Thanks for the info, Sarah. This was an incredible experience, and I can't wait to visit our local zoo and learn more. And Arabella says, very nice. So thank you so much. I'm going to add my thanks. And just to wrap it up formally, thank you so much to Sarah Peterson and Jason Pickley for being here with us today. A big thank you to our digital team for producing the program. An even bigger thanks to you, the audience, for taking time to be here. Free access to the waters, both online and in person, is made possible through the combined generosity of individual donors, foundations, corporations, and grants from the City of Baltimore, Maryland State Arts Council, Citizens of Baltimore County, the Howard County Government, and the Howard County Arts Council. We look forward to welcoming you back for more virtual programs and for upcoming programming, including artist talks, curatorial lectures, performances, and more. Please visit our website at thewaters.org. And if you'd like to support The Waters, head to the link, thewaters.org/give. Finally, be safe, be well, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Take care.